This evening, broadcasting from New York City, Chris Hayes reporting. In breaking developments, the individual designated by Donald Trump to oversee border enforcement has publicly stated that federal activities in Minnesota are coming to a close. According to the announcement, the president has given approval to wind down what they've called a surge deployment in the region. Some tactical response units will remain positioned in the area temporarily, a precautionary measure meant to address any escalation in confrontational incidents or ensure such events continue their downward trend. Complete withdrawal of all personnel isn't happening immediately, as officer safety remains a stated concern. However, the operation they branded as Metro Surge has officially reached its endpoint. Those living in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and throughout Minnesota, as well as observers monitoring these events nationally, remain cautious about accepting any premature declarations of success. This skepticism stems from previous statements made by this administration, including remarks from Tom Homan just weeks earlier. The prudent approach now involves waiting to see whether actions align with words. Even as of today, anecdotal accounts continue emerging about immigration and customs enforcement presence throughout Minneapolis. That being said, the messaging represents a noticeable shift in approach and appears to signal an actual modification in strategy, similar to what unfolded in Chicago, where Operation Midway Blitz concluded with federal forces being redeployed elsewhere. All indicators suggest the Trump administration has genuinely altered its tactical stance. Perhaps they've finally grasped that their occupation-style presence in an American state proved to be a strategic disaster. Their apparent calculation was straightforward: deploy heavy-handed federal enforcement into Minneapolis, demonstrate aggressive authority, and execute what can only be described as an explicitly racialized campaign targeting and intimidating non-white residents of the Twin Cities, with Somali American communities bearing the brunt of harassment, defamation, and systematic intimidation. The expectation was political rewards would follow. Instead, they encountered near universal opposition. The response has been overwhelmingly negative across every segment of the ideological landscape in this remarkably diverse metropolitan area. Residents formed a united front alongside their neighbors. What emerged was an extraordinary display of civic defiance unlike anything witnessed in recent memory. Community members organized food distribution networks for residents too frightened to venture to supermarkets. Volunteer drivers transported friends and neighbors who feared using public transit. In some cases, passengers would crouch low in rear seats to avoid detection by federal agents. Coordinated school safety networks materialized at virtually every educational institution and childcare facility across the entire metropolitan region. In temperatures dropping to 5 degrees below zero, these volunteers maintained morning patrol schedules at schools, standing watch during afternoon pickup to prevent children, parents, or educators from being seized at bus stops or during school drop-offs. Ordinary citizens constructed this entire protective infrastructure spontaneously, building it from nothing. Grassroots mutual aid networks sprang into existence simply to safeguard one another. This phenomenon was documented firsthand during reporting trips to Minneapolis 2 weeks prior. The community refused to surrender even after their organized opposition resulted in 2 fatalities within a single month. Every volunteer participating in these efforts, those conducting school patrols, monitoring federal agent movements throughout the city, witnessed Renee Good and Alex Priddy gunned down by their own government in full daylight, with zero accountability for those who pulled the triggers. And their response? They continued resisting regardless. They refused to abandon their stance. They refused to capitulate. They rejected Donald Trump and Stephen Miller's authoritarian blueprint for America. Today's announcement suggests they may have successfully repelled these forces, at least temporarily. Yet again, quantifying the true cost of this occupation approaches impossibility. Beyond the 2 lives lost, beyond those wounded by gunfire, beyond injuries from vehicle collisions caused by ICE operations, beyond those who were detained, there exists a cascade of unmeasurable damage. Numerous individuals have almost certainly postponed or avoided medical treatment. Residents throughout the Twin Cities with chronic health conditions, expectant mothers who skipped prenatal examinations because of justified fear, these consequences compound daily. Consider Aliyah Rahman, a disabled United States citizen who was apprehended while traveling to receive treatment for her traumatic brain injury, forcibly extracted from her vehicle after agents shattered her windows. Parents kept children home from educational institutions. Educators across the district reported this consistently amid widespread accounts of ICE raids occurring at bus stops and even on school property. Now concerns are mounting that Minnesota schools face potential funding losses tied to attendance drops, given that state funding calculations rely on attendance metrics. Federal funding operates similarly. This analysis hasn't even begun addressing the collective psychological trauma inflicted upon this community. The trauma experienced by children like Liam Ramos, a 5-year-old boy who will carry permanent memories of being instrumentalized as bait by ICE agents to lure his father into the open, subsequently detained and transported to Texas. Such cruelty leaves permanent scars. However, critically, that cruelty did not achieve victory. Consider this. This administration wagered, and continues wagering, that the majority of Americans share Stephen Miller's bigotry. They've been proven wrong repeatedly. Time after time, the American public has risen in rejection, stating clearly, absolutely not. This resistance extends far beyond Minnesota's borders. It's a nationwide phenomenon. When authorities mistakenly transferred Kilmar Abrams Garcia to an overseas detention facility operating with minimal oversight in El Salvador, official statements declared his permanent removal was guaranteed. Yet due to massive public pressure and outcry, including a personal visit from Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen, he was returned to United States soil. Federal prosecutors are attempting to press criminal charges and continue pursuing deportation. But currently, he remains with his family because people continue fighting on his behalf. Numerous similar cases exist where the administration detained individuals inappropriately, faced exposure, confronted public scrutiny, and was forced to reverse course. Take the case from last year involving Narciso Barranco, father to 3 United States Marines. Video captured him being violently detained, struck, and wrestled to the pavement while performing landscaping work outside a California IHOP location. Government arguments claimed he posed a threat because he was holding his weed trimmer equipment. Local media outlets covered the incident extensively. Regional reporters brought it to wider attention. National coverage followed. Public outrage intensified. The outcome? Today, an immigration judge dismissed his deportation proceedings entirely. Public pressure similarly secured freedom for pro-Palestinian activists Eza Oztark and Mahmoud Khalil, who faced unconstitutional detention by this administration, specifically targeting their First Amendment protected speech. This week brought additional developments. Another immigration court ruled that Oztark cannot face deportation according to his legal representation. He returned to Capitol Hill this week, advocating for other individuals targeted by this administration, even as his own case continues through judicial proceedings. Nothing has concluded here. Nobody harbors illusions otherwise. But the fundamental lesson remains clear. They can be defeated. This administration is not invincible. The crucial reason they can be beaten centers on one fact. Ordinary people residing in this country from vastly different backgrounds, ethnicities, racial identities, religious traditions, and philosophical perspectives fundamentally reject what's happening. They've been standing in opposition. Not everyone working against Trump's vision of an ethnically pure, blood and soil nation necessarily agrees on every policy question or sees eye to eye on all matters, but they share fundamental values of neighborliness and basic human decency. That proves to be a remarkably potent force. Tonight brings to mind a conversation with a pastor encountered while protesting outside an ICE detention facility in Minnesota. His words carry weight. We're going to outlast them. Exhaustion won't defeat us. They'll grow tired first, and they'll withdraw. The country will grow tired of ICE abusing people in this manner. He referenced a local tradition, the question of when ice melts from the lakes, called Ice Out Day. People used to position old vehicles on frozen lakes and place wagers on when the car would break through. We understand how to wait until ice out. People in this region are going to outlast ice and will be present when ice is out. We're engaged in a fierce, continuous, daily political struggle over the fundamental character of this nation. Those championing the more humane, compassionate vision possess numerical superiority. This confrontation isn't theoretical or distant. It's immediate and ongoing. Every single day presents another chapter in this battle. The federal occupation of Minnesota wasn't just about immigration enforcement. It represented something far more sinister, a deliberate attempt to normalize authoritarian tactics on American soil. The strategy involved selecting a diverse, politically progressive metropolitan area and subjecting it to aggressive shows of force designed to break community solidarity. What the architects of this operation failed to anticipate was the depth of social cohesion already existing in these communities. Minneapolis and St. Paul aren't abstractions. These are places where neighbors know neighbors, where diverse populations have built relationships over decades, where civic institutions run deep. When federal agents arrived with their armored vehicles and tactical gear, they encountered not a fragmented population ripe for intimidation, but a tightly woven social fabric that immediately activated protective mechanisms. The response wasn't organized by any central authority or political organization. It emerged organically from the grassroots. Consider the logistics involved in what residents accomplished. Coordinating school safety patrols across an entire metropolitan region requires immense volunteer mobilization. Someone had to create communication networks, establish shift schedules, develop protocols for documenting incidents, and maintain morale when temperatures plummeted and danger remained constant. Food distribution networks don't materialize spontaneously. Volunteers needed to identify vulnerable residents, coordinate delivery routes, secure food supplies, and maintain operations day after day. Transportation networks for those afraid to use public transit required drivers willing to put themselves at risk, fuel costs, route planning, and communication systems to connect those needing rides with available drivers. All of this happened while participants faced genuine danger. These weren't symbolic gestures or performative activism. Federal agents had already demonstrated their willingness to use lethal force. 2 people had already died. Others had been wounded. Vehicle collisions during pursuit operations had caused injuries. The threat was concrete and immediate, yet the resistance continued. That persistence reveals something profound about human nature and community bonds. When people feel their neighbors are under unjust attack, when they witness government power being wielded with discriminatory intent, when they see children being terrorized and families torn apart, many discover reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. The targeting of Somali American communities wasn't incidental. It reflected a calculated decision to focus enforcement efforts on a population already subjected to decades of discrimination, surveillance, and stereotyping following September 11th. The assumption was that targeting Muslims, targeting immigrants from Africa, targeting non-white communities would face minimal opposition from the broader public. That calculation proved disastrously wrong. Instead of division, the response was solidarity. White residents stood alongside Black residents. Christian congregations supported Muslim neighbors. Longtime citizens defended recent arrivals. The diversity of Minneapolis became its strength rather than its vulnerability. This dynamic confounded the administration's playbook. Their entire strategy depends on exploiting division, on convincing majority populations that minority communities represent threats deserving harsh treatment. When communities refuse to be divided, when they instead unify in opposition, the strategy collapses. The cases of individuals like Aliyah Rahman illustrate the indiscriminate nature of this enforcement approach. A disabled United States citizen traveling to medical treatment should represent the clearest possible case of someone who shouldn't face detention, yet agents broke her car windows and extracted her forcibly. This wasn't careful, targeted enforcement. It was aggressive action prioritizing intimidation over accuracy. The incident with Narciso Barranco carries similar significance. A father of 3 Marines performing legal work, holding landscaping equipment, detained violently and publicly. If even this profile doesn't provide protection from aggressive enforcement, it signals that nobody is safe. That's precisely the message the administration intended to send. Cooperate, stay silent, don't resist, or you could be next. But again, the response wasn't compliance. It was outrage. Local media coverage led to regional attention, then national spotlight, then public pressure that ultimately resulted in dismissal of deportation proceedings. The system worked not because it was designed to work, but because people forced it to work through sustained attention and advocacy. The detention and deportation of Kilmar Abrams Garcia to El Salvador represents an even more extreme case. Sending individuals to overseas facilities with minimal oversight represents a deliberate attempt to place them beyond the reach of legal advocacy, media attention, and public pressure. Out of sight, out of mind, that's the calculation, except it didn't work. People noticed. Senator Chris Van Hollen traveled personally to El Salvador to visit him. Media outlets covered the story. Public pressure built until authorities had no choice but to return him to United States soil. He still faces charges and deportation proceedings, but he's at least within reach of proper legal representation and public accountability. The pattern repeats across numerous cases. Detention of pro-Palestinian activists Eza Oztark and Mahmoud Khalil, based solely on their political speech, represented an obvious First Amendment violation. Yet it happened anyway, suggesting either ignorance of constitutional limits or deliberate disregard for them. Only sustained legal challenge and public attention secured their release. That Oztark returned to Capitol Hill to advocate for others while still fighting his own case demonstrates remarkable courage and commitment. Rather than focusing solely on his personal legal jeopardy, he's working to help others facing similar targeting. This represents exactly the kind of solidarity and mutual aid that built the resistance in Minneapolis. These individual stories connect to broader questions about what kind of society we're building. Every society faces the question of how it treats vulnerable populations, how it balances security concerns with civil liberties, how it incorporates newcomers, how it protects minority rights against majority will. The Trump administration has provided clear answers to these questions, and those answers are: vulnerable populations deserve harsh treatment that will deter others. Security concerns justify almost unlimited government power. Newcomers should be viewed with suspicion and hostility. Minority rights are obstacles to be overcome rather than values to be protected. But the resistance in Minnesota and across the country has offered different answers. Vulnerable populations deserve protection and solidarity. Security doesn't require abandoning basic decency and constitutional limits. Newcomers enrich communities rather than threatening them. Minority rights are precisely what separate free societies from authoritarian ones. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's playing out in real time through concrete actions and consequences. Children like Liam Ramos will carry psychological scars from being used as bait to trap his father. That's not hypothetical trauma. That's a 5-year-old child who witnessed his parent being taken away after agents deliberately manipulated him. The developmental psychology research on childhood trauma is unambiguous. Witnessing parental detention, experiencing household raids, living in constant fear of family separation, these experiences produce lasting psychological impacts. Anxiety, depression, difficulties with trust and attachment, academic struggles, behavioral problems, the effects cascade across multiple domains of functioning. Multiply that trauma across every child who witnessed raids at schools or bus stops, every child kept home from school out of fear, every child whose parent was detained, every child whose household lived in constant anxiety, and the collective psychological toll becomes staggering. The educational impacts extend beyond trauma. When students miss weeks of school, they fall behind academically. Teachers can't effectively instruct students who aren't present. Schools lose funding based on attendance calculations, which creates budget pressures that affect all students. The ripple effects continue expanding outward. Medical impacts may prove even more severe. Chronic conditions require consistent monitoring and treatment. Pregnancy demands regular prenatal care to identify complications early. Traumatic brain injuries require ongoing therapeutic intervention. When people forego necessary medical care out of fear, conditions worsen, complications develop, and outcomes deteriorate. Some of these health impacts may prove fatal. A pregnancy complication caught early can often be managed successfully. Caught late, it might result in maternal or fetal death. A chronic condition managed with medication remains stable. Unmanaged, it spirals into crisis. We won't know the full health toll for months or years, if ever. The economic impacts affect both individuals and communities. People afraid to work lose income. Businesses lose employees and customers. Economic activity contracts. Tax revenues decline, the costs multiply and compound. All of this damage, psychological, educational, medical, economic, was inflicted deliberately. This wasn't collateral damage from well-intentioned policy. This was the intended outcome. The goal was to create so much fear and disruption that immigrant communities would either self-deport or become invisible, and that broader communities would accept harsh enforcement as normal. Instead, communities responded with mutual aid and solidarity. Rather than abandoning vulnerable neighbors, residents built protective infrastructure. Rather than accepting intimidation as inevitable, they organized resistance. Rather than normalizing cruelty, they insisted on decency. That response reflects deeply held values about community, reciprocity, and human dignity. These aren't values unique to progressives or liberals. They're broadly shared across ideological lines. Even people who support stricter immigration enforcement generally don't support terrorizing children or denying medical care to pregnant women or using citizens as bait. The administration gambled that most Americans would tolerate or support such tactics if they were targeted at the right people: immigrants, Muslims, people of color. That gamble failed because it fundamentally misread American values and character. This doesn't mean America has solved its problems with racism, xenophobia, or discrimination. Clearly, it hasn't. But it does mean that when government power is wielded with obvious cruelty against vulnerable populations, many Americans instinctively recoil and resist, regardless of their abstract policy preferences. The pastor's comment about outlasting ICE captures this dynamic perfectly. He's not predicting imminent victory or claiming the struggle will be easy. He's expressing confidence that endurance and persistence will ultimately prevail over aggression and intimidation. The metaphor of ice out day, waiting for frozen lakes to thaw, evokes both the Minnesota climate and the patient determination required for long-term resistance. Ice doesn't melt suddenly, it melts gradually as temperatures slowly rise and pressure accumulates, but eventually, inevitably, it melts. The resistance in Minneapolis represents the same gradual, patient, determined pressure. Federal agents have tactical advantages: weapons, legal authority, organizational resources, but they also have disadvantages. They're outsiders in an unfamiliar community. They face sustained opposition from residents. They generate negative media coverage. They create political problems for their superiors. Those disadvantages compound over time. Maintaining an occupation requires constant resources and attention. Officers grow tired and demoralized. Negative press coverage continues. Political pressure builds. Eventually, the costs exceed any perceived benefits, and authorities withdraw. That appears to be what's happening now. The announcement of operations concluding in Minnesota suggests the administration has concluded that the political and resource costs outweigh any benefits from continued presence. They're withdrawing not because they achieved their objectives, but because they failed to break community resistance. This represents an important victory, but it's crucial not to overstate it or view it as final. The Trump administration hasn't abandoned its broader agenda. They're still pursuing mass deportations nationwide. They're still targeting immigrant communities. They're still pushing for harsher enforcement policies. What's changed is tactical approach. The overwhelming occupation of Minneapolis generated too much opposition and negative coverage. They'll likely shift to less visible, more targeted operations that generate fewer news headlines and less organized resistance. The challenge for resistance movements is maintaining mobilization even as tactics change. Sustained mass mobilization is difficult under any circumstances. People have jobs, families, responsibilities. When the immediate visible threat recedes, participation often declines even though underlying dangers remain. That's why the emphasis on endurance and outlasting proves so important. This isn't a single confrontation that will be definitively won or lost. It's an ongoing struggle that will continue through changing tactics, shifting contexts, and evolving challenges. The victories matter because they demonstrate that resistance is possible and effective. When Narciso Barranco's deportation case was dismissed, it showed that public pressure can change outcomes. When Kilmar Abrams Garcia was returned from El Salvador, it showed that even the most extreme actions can be reversed. When Eza Oztark secured a ruling blocking deportation, it showed that constitutional rights retain meaning when people fight to defend them. Each victory encourages further resistance by demonstrating that efforts aren't futile. Each case where public pressure changes outcomes inspires people to apply pressure in other cases. The successes build momentum and confidence, but the losses matter too, and they cannot be forgotten. Renee Good and Alex Pretty are dead. No amount of eventual policy changes will bring them back to their families. Their deaths represent permanent losses, irreversible tragedies resulting directly from government policy choices. Their memory should serve as motivation for continued resistance, but also as a sobering reminder of the real stakes involved. This isn't a theoretical debate or a political game. It's a struggle with life and death consequences for real human beings. The question of what kind of country America will become isn't answered once and permanently. It's answered continuously through millions of individual choices and actions. Every person who volunteers for school patrols, who drives a frightened neighbor, who organizes food distribution, who makes phone calls on behalf of detained individuals, every one of those people is casting a vote for one vision of America over another. And crucially, those votes count. They matter. They have concrete impacts on real outcomes. The resistance in Minneapolis didn't just make participants feel good about themselves, it actually changed government policy. Federal operations are concluding specifically because community resistance made them unsustainable. That's the fundamental lesson that should be drawn from these events. Organized, sustained, community-based resistance can defeat even well-resourced government enforcement operations. Ordinary people without special training, without significant financial resources, without institutional power, they can nonetheless prevail through solidarity, persistence, and moral courage. This lesson applies far beyond immigration enforcement. It applies to any situation where government or corporate power is wielded unjustly against vulnerable populations. The specific tactics may vary depending on context, but the underlying principles remain constant. Organize collectively, maintain sustained pressure, refuse to normalize cruelty, protect the vulnerable, build solidarity across differences. American history provides numerous examples of these principles in action. The civil rights movement defeated Jim Crow segregation through sustained, organized resistance. The labor movement won basic workplace protections through collective action and solidarity. The LGBTQ rights movement achieved marriage equality through decades of advocacy and organizing. None of these victories came easily or quickly. All required years or decades of sustained effort. All faced powerful opposition. All experienced setbacks and defeats along the way, but all ultimately succeeded because enough people organized collectively and refused to give up. The resistance in Minneapolis stands in that tradition. It's part of an ongoing American story of communities organizing to defend human dignity against unjust power. The specific issues and contexts change, but the fundamental dynamic remains. When people unite around shared values and maintain sustained pressure, they can force even powerful institutions to change course. The statement that the better, more humane vision have the numbers on their side captures this fundamental reality. Public opinion polling consistently shows that Americans support treating immigrants humanely, protecting refugees, keeping families together, and limiting aggressive enforcement tactics that terrorize communities. That majority opinion doesn't automatically translate into policy outcomes. Political systems are complex and responsive to many factors beyond simple majority preference. But it does mean that sustained organizing can mobilize public sentiment into effective political pressure.